Welcome to Aspects of Aliyah. For the next 3-4 sessions, we're going to discuss anti-Semitism. As you're all well aware, anti-Semitism worldwide has exploded following the awful events of October the 7th. Anti-Semitism is an age-old phenomenon, but today we're witnessing an awakening of the violence and hatred that's persisted over the centuries. Many people were of the opinion that anti-Semitism is a recent phenomenon and that the Holocaust brought an end to anti-Judaism, Jewish hatred, and all the attendant tropes that went along with it, such as the Jews control the world, the Jews control the world's finances, the Jews have undue influence, the Jews are involved in secret societies, and all kinds of things. But these sort of things were thought to have faded, but they hadn't. They were merely slumbering. Anti-Semitism slumbers. It doesn't sleep. It's there, waiting to arise with all its hatred and violence, given an opportunity. When Israel responded in the correct manner, all sovereign nations have a right to defend themselves. Immediately, anti-Semitism broke out all over the world. Canada, USA, Latin America, on that side of the world, Australia, New Zealand, across the Middle East, obviously, through Europe and UK. I'm sad to report that in the UK, there have been 4,000 anti-Semitic incidents since October the 7th. By the end of February, that will be. We witnessed recently, amidst all this virtue signalling, pro-Palestinianism, chants for jihad, chants for the river to the sea, for the extermination of all the Jewish people. And the height of this was when a screaming mob outside the Houses of Parliament projected from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, on the Elizabeth Tower. The tower that Big Ben, our iconic clock in the Houses of Parliament, stands on. The police made no attempt to stop this whatsoever. There's a good question here. Why is there two-tier policing in UK? And similar things seem to be happening in other countries as well, where the pro-Palestinian lobby, which, let's be honest about this, has arisen out of sectarianism. Most people on the rallies that go on these things don't know any of the history. They pick placards up that are given and join in chants that they don't know what they mean, supposedly. And it's brought the whole nation in the UK into chaos. And similarly, in the United States and Canada, chaotic events are taking place. Synagogues being attacked. Jewish people being attacked. Graveyards desecrated. Baying mobs outside houses of governance, not only in England, but in Europe and the Americas. So what is actually anti-Semitism? Where does it begin? How does it start? What's it about? So, what we're going to do is, together, we're going to look at the origins of anti-Semitism. We're going to look at its history. And the first session we're going to do today is anti-Semitism in the ancient world. Anti-Semitism in the ancient world. So, where do we begin, and how does anti-Semitism grow and develop? It first starts off with contempt. And as we go through these sessions, we'll see that contempt plays a very big part and almost is the lighting of the fuse for what will develop into something extremely violent and destructive. So, if we look in the early chapters of the scriptures, we find that Sarah, who's about to, or is promised to have the child of destiny, we might say, the child for the future, is barren. And Hagar, Abraham's other lady, shall we say, mocks her, treats her with contempt, as she's given birth to Ishmael. And this gives a picture of what will happen throughout history. The descendants of Sarah are going to be the Jewish people. Descendants of Hagar are going to be the Arab people. And the Muslims in particular, and the Arabs, see Ishmael as their father, their founder figure. But it says of Ishmael in the scripture that Ishmael is a wild kicking donkey of a man who will never live at peace with his brother. Never live at peace with his brother. So really, time for a pause for thought on this one, isn't it? Because if you look at the history of the Islamic nations and the Arab nations, we'll find that they've always been at war with each other. And we'll find that in the modern era, there's been more Arab nations at war with each other than any other sort of grouping of people. And we'll also find, of course, that Ishmael and Isaac, they were actually brothers with the same father. And Isaiah does say, the Lord says in Isaiah, he hasn't forgotten Ishmael. So hopefully there will be some sort of reconciliation at the end of the day. So it starts with contempt. So what happens next in history? Well, the nation in embryonic form, if you like, because of famine, go to Egypt. And they're getting on very well there to start with. And then we find later that they're in a condition that's referred to generally as slavery, but they were not slaves. They were a corvée, forced labour. Forced labour, like being in prison, really, almost. The whole nation, or people, if you like, were forced on this very hard labour and treated very badly, we might add. In Egypt, it was a strange time during the reign of Pharaoh Seti, who was there from 1308 to 1294, I think it was. And Pharaoh was obviously married to his sister, and the upper classes tended to marry relatives, very close relatives, or even the sisters, because they felt there was a divine spark within the family, and a god could only marry a god. But Egypt was very stretched, was involved in these massive narcissistic projects, and were becoming rather weak. On the other hand, the Hebrews were becoming strong and thriving. Pharaoh didn't like this, so he decided in his wisdom to make life even harder for them and to drive them harder. Moses sees this, has some time in the desert, has his revelation, his theophany, if you like, in the burning bush, and he goes back, and the records are there for you to read in Exodus, and the first time these words are spoken, they'll echo through history. The modern era was spoken many times by the Jewish people in the former Soviet Union. Let my people go. Pharaoh decided he wasn't going to do that at all. So God therefore judges Pharaoh, Egypt, and the gods of Egypt with the plagues. Each plague represents an object of worship or a god in the Egyptian pantheon of gods. When things get absolutely terrible, Pharaoh decides to let the people go. In the midst of this, his own son dies. In a fit of rage and hatred, he releases his army, his horsemen, his chariots, to pursue the not fleeing, but marching in good order Hebrew people on their way to their destiny. And we know what happened after this. The horsemen and the chariots, the soldiers, were drowned in the sea, and the Hebrews went forward towards their promise. The thing we need to see here, this was the first decision to destroy every single one. Every single one. Content, hatred, punishment, death. There's an old saying, and we'll find this, and it starts from the book of Esther, which is where we're going to go now. In Esther, Hadass, chapter 3, we find there are three people involved, basically, have been involved in what's happening here. Firstly, we have Mordecai, and Mordecai was a counsellor to the king, we'd say, and we know this because it says that he sat in the city gate. The city gate was like the parliament, if you like, the king's advisors, the elders, whatever term you want to use. He was one of them. And then we had Haman, the Agagite, who was extremely jealous of Mordecai. And he was seeking his destruction. And in his hatred and his contempt for Mordecai, who was Jewish, his hatred and his contempt, he plotted against Mordecai. And he said these words that have echoed through history. There are a people amongst us who are not like us. And if we wanted to give an overarching comment of the operation of anti-Semitism, we could use a sentence something like this. First they said, you have no right to live amongst us and be different. Then they said, you've got no right to live amongst us. And then they said, you've no right to live. And we'll see how this begins to play out more and more as the historical process unfolds. In the eventuality, Esther takes a great chance on her own life and she prepares herself to go and plead for mercy with the king. Esther makes a case, the Jewish people are spared, and Haman is hung on his own gallows, this big gallows they prepared to hang Mordecai upon in public as the rest of the Jewish people throughout the empire were being slaughtered. So from there, let's move on a little bit more. We're going to move forward now to the time after the close of what today is the Old Testament canon and the rise of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was from Macedonia, Greece, if you like, and was the son of Philip, who was a mighty general. And Alexander took over, and he's known as one of the greatest generals in ancient history. Alexander proceeded through the Levant down into Egypt, and when he was in Egypt, he went to Thebes and proclaimed himself as a god. He became a god. Came back from Thebes and said he was a god. And from this time onwards, he was worshipped as God, and people used to bow down before him, and he used to dress in the costumes of the various gods, male and female, banquets and feasts and so on. He proceeded across the Middle East until he got to India. And when he got to the east coast of India, it's recorded that he sat down and cried because there was no world left to conquer. No world left to conquer. He died at a young age on his way back in Babylon, of all places, which Babylon is regarded as, I'm sure we all know, as the centre of all occult practices. During this period, the story says that the high priest in Jerusalem had a vision of Alexander, and when they were making their way that way, the high priest and a deputation came and met Alexander and said they'd seen in a prophecy that he was to come, and they basically handed Israel over to him. And this reign persisted for a good number of years with some quite disastrous consequences. When he died, his empire was split between Ptolemy and Seleucus and his descendants, the Seleucids, governed the part of the empire that was split for them, which included the Levant and Israel at the time. This was a profound effect when what process known as Hellenization began to take place and Jewish identity became despised, abused, and attacked. So now we're going to go to Ezra, and we'll continue when we come back and see what happened in this reign.
Ezra International is a Christian nonprofit organization that helps Jewish people immigrate to Israel, or as they say in Israel, make Aliyah. Through your generous support, we are able to help Jewish people make Aliyah by providing one-on-one support for Jewish people in their home countries, completing in-depth ancestry research, by procuring necessary immigration documents, and finally, financing the immigration journey. Since 1995, Ezra International supporters have helped tens of thousands of people from around the world, and thousands are still waiting to return to Israel. God said he would be known by both the Jewish people and the nations when he restores them to their land. Your financial gift helps make that happen. Give now and be part of this great prophetic restoration process. Go to ezrainternational.org and give your gift of hope today.
Welcome back. We're in Israel now. The Greeks have been there a while, and this Hellenization process is taking place. And it became very, very anti-Jewish contempt, and various rules and laws were put in place that eventually would proscribe Judaism as a religion. It became religio illicita, not allowed. Holy books were burnt, synagogues were closed, and circumcision was banned. Death sentences were pronounced on women who circumcised the children, and death sentences were pronounced for any hint of practices of Judaism. Altars were set up where the holy shrines were, along roads and places like this, and unclean animals were slaughtered over them. Things came to a head with the reign of one, of these Seleucid kings, the worst one, infamous in history, who was named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. His name is rather interesting because Epiphanes, as most of you might know, means God made manifest. And Antiochus Epiphanes took his own divinity extremely seriously and encouraged the complete and utter destruction. It was working on initially what's called a passive ethnocide, is where you take a people's identity away, and this is either done by deportation or it's done by removing every cultural trace, religion, philosophy, literature, there is no art in Judaism at this time, as you know, the folklores and traditions. So, sometime between about 167, 168, Antiochus decided to deliver the coup de grace to Judaism, and he sacrificed a pig in the temple over the holy books, defiling the holy books, defiling the temple, and this was an absolute outrage. The consequences of this, without being too long-winded about it, in short, was the Maccabean revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, and eventually the Greeks were put down, and then the Romans came in, more or less on the back of this, and then the Jewish people became subject to the Roman Empire. Now, the important thing in the anti-Semitic thing, and particularly the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes, will show us one thing we're going to start to see more and more. These things are not per se against individual Jewish people. They're not, in one sense, simply against the Jewish people. They're against God. And the reason for this is God took a people for himself. We often hear this expression, chosen people. I don't think that's a good translation or even a good understanding. God chose a people to represent himself. A people to represent himself, his character, who he was. And he elected them to live a life that will be an example to all, to show who God is and how mankind can walk in harmony with him. They were to be a light to the nations. And the devil and all his works want to extinguish that light. Now, you can't kill God. You can't go up to heaven and throw him off his throne, although that was tried at the Tower of Babel. You can't do any of these things. You cannot remove God. As Paul says, even the creation witnesses to these things. You can't remove God, but you can remove the evidence. If God's representative or chosen people don't exist anymore, then you more or less prove that he doesn't exist either. And there's another great power, whatever that is. People are speculating all manner of matters. But the truth of the matter is, anti-Semitism is against God. It's a move to remove the evidence of God. So now we're going to enter into the Roman times. We're going to enter into the time of Yeshua, and the Judaisms of the time were quite different. There were many different stripes of Judaism: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, 3 sorts of Essenes, 3 or 4 sorts of Zealots, all claiming to be the true Israel, all fighting with each other from time to time, but very focused against the Romans. Now, the Romans despised the Jewish people because they felt basically they were atheists, because they wouldn't worship all their gods. And they certainly would not bow down and worship the emperor. So the Romans came to a bit of a Mexican standoff, as we call it today, and they allowed the Jewish people to practice their Judaism as long as they prayed for the emperor, as long as they prayed for the emperor. This was all to come to an end in the year 70, when, as a result of the Zealot revolts, the Romans invaded, if you like, or sent the army in under Titus and reduced Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And they felt not only that they beat them physically, they felt that they destroyed their God in the meantime. You've got to remember, in the ancient world, Romans have their own gods, but they also believed other people have their gods as well. So you have to sort of try and destroy their God as well as destroying the people. Well, as you know, the Jewish people began to be scattered to the ends of the earth almost. But there was a remnant that stayed behind, a very small one. But what we find is, after this, it's not very long before the church has become fairly established by this time, at the turn of the century, starts to despise the Jewish people because it's mostly Gentile by this time, following not only the mission of Paul, but the mission of Peter and other disciples and their disciples who were taking the message as per the Great Commission of Matthew 28. And we find by the time of the revolts in the 120s and so on afterwards, culminating in the disaster at Masada, the Jews and the church are completely separated by this time, because the Christians would not support the Jewish people in their revolt. So there's animosity on both sides. But we find a key moment that should not be ignored. And in the second century, after the fall of Masada, a great philosopher, pagan philosopher, Justin, converted to Christianity, and he wrote several treatises, books, if you like, that dealt with a number of subjects. But his major work was Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, and it cast a conversation between himself and this Jewish man named Trypho, who's survived the revolt. And in chapter 16 of Dialogue, he says to Trypho, "You must understand, Trypho, that the scriptures and the prophets no longer belong to the Jewish people. They now belong to the church. Replacement theology, supersessionism has been born." And Trypho is treated with contempt. Now, as time goes on, the church as we know it and understand it today starts really in 327 with the ascension of Emperor Constantine, who changed Christianity from being a religio illicita to a religio licita, from being illegal to being legal. Now, the church fought and had quite some desperate times with the Romans, the Roman Empire, but the church thrived. And there were many variations of Christianity in the early days and before the canon, and many of them used different Jewish documents and writings from the intertestamental period, as it's called, better called the Second Temple period, and used things like the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, and many other ones that we could talk for hours about, but won't. But sufficient to say, those that became known as the Church Fathers were all grossly anti-Semitic and into replacement theology. So, the history of anti-Semitism of the early Church Fathers was well, I wouldn't say it's hidden, it was ignored. So let's just look at one or two very, very quickly. Very, very quickly, let's just look at one or two. Ambrose of Milan, burn the synagogues down. John Chrysostom, I have invested in you. Now, repay the interest on removing, destroying, attacking the Jewish people. Augustine, the Jews bear the mark of Cain. Be wary of them. Bear the mark of Cain. Yeah. Dangerous, dangerous people. I could give you many more examples. For Ephraim the Syrian, for instance. Many, many more. Tertullian, you name it. Any of the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers' writings read like a who's who of anti-Semitism. It's a dreadful, dreadful thing. A who's who of anti-Semitism. So, we're going to close our session here, and when we return, we'll be looking at the medieval period.